The city was festively decorated. Even the air was filled with a kind of solemnity. The people welcomed the arriving hero, who sat proudly in the saddle of a spirited steed. Then the commander said that if not, then let him not repeat such absurd actions as yesterday. Little children, a brother and sister, hurried to the parade to see the famous hero along with everyone else. The girl got tired and asked her little brother to move slower, but for some reason he stopped. A man was walking down the street with a sack over his shoulder, which caught their attention. He asked Mason if he knew how such a thing was. The children watched this strange man heading towards the palace with amazement and apprehension. The children decided that he was cursed. There, a girl who called the young man Minold was waiting for the mage. Minold shook the monster's head out of the bag and declared that the last threat to Isgarth had now been eliminated. The girl thanked him on behalf of the entire empire, but the young man asked her to simply fulfill her promise. He did not want to listen to her words, but desired to get what was promised right now. These meetings are always accompanied by terrible headaches for me. She inquired of the mage whether she should now call him Mason. The girl reminded him that she had made him a dark mage, not because she disliked him, but because he had worked for the good of the empire in complete obscurity. And this deserved boundless gratitude, to which the mage replied that he disliked her and would like to kill her. The girl asked Minold if he really wanted to return to his native world. In this form I see him. Mr. Sheehy is a friendly and pleasant man who runs a decent gym. The girl asked him to stay just in case, and then she would reward him for all the troubles that had befallen him and for all the neglect he had endured. Mason was curious to find out what level his 2 hunter stars were. She dragged him into this world by force, and he toiled for her like a slave. Did she really want him to stay and continue wiping her ass until the end of days? What will he get in return? The girl replied that if he stayed, he would get everything he didn't wish for, and then Minold asked her to get him a Korean-style grilled chicken. Then the 2-star hunter asked what was going on with their radar, and he was reported that there were no equipment problems, and now they were checking for blind spots. The guest ordered to report to the logistics center and additionally install 2 more radars. The girl replied shyly that they could work on that. Then the hunter turned to Mason and stated that he had acted very bravely and responded quickly to the situation from the very beginning. But why did he not take care of himself by fighting without equipment? He really wants to collect awards in his favorite game, Strongest Dungeon Fighters. He urgently needs to enter it, and the girl exclaimed that he should ask her for something that exists in this world. Finally, she realized that Minold would not stay and decided to start the relocation ritual. The mage glanced around the palace hall and said that he had many memories associated with this place, although he no longer wanted to see it ever again. The girl ordered Minold to stand in the center of the summoning circle, where he had first appeared in this world. The dark mage fulfilled her request, standing in the center of the magic circle. First, the girl freed him from the patronage of holiness. Minold thought that despite its name, this thing did not protect, but rather served as a chain, restraining him from killing this woman.
Y uno de los cables se clavó en mi espalda. El dolor era terrible.
The girl made one last attempt to dissuade Minold from his decision to return and said, surely the incredible power he had gained in this world, as well as the riches and glory awaiting him, would not prevent him from deciding to leave this world?
El ambiente en la sala era caluroso, y debido al humo de monóxido de carbono, no había absolutamente nada que respirar.
The girl hastily stated that in that case she would humbly accept her fate. After all, she had started it all.
Tan pronto como me tensé, sucedió algo sobrenatural. Un portal se abrió desde el edificio hacia el exterior. Fuimos.
Now she will deprive him of the powers he gained by entering Isgard. It is dangerous for him to enter the portal with these forces. Mason involuntarily listened to this dialogue and asked what they were talking about. He said that he had invested a lot of effort in developing his power and was not going to give it up so easily. He simply would not allow her to take it away. The girl fell to the floor of the hall and screamed loudly. She understood Minold's plan, however. Being a dark mage, he would not be able to open the portal. But the next second she widened her eyes in surprise. Minold managed to open the passage with the help of dark magic. The girl ordered the mage to stop because he cannot use interdimensional magic so carelessly. But Minold replied that he knew this, and that's why he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, for he was now at the peak of his powers. He found it strange that they were dividing magic into dark and light here, for it was one and the same thing. Then Minold told the girl that he had something for her at last. He rudely said that he hoped never to meet her again, and if they did meet, she would not live. After that, Minold said goodbye and disappeared into the portal. The girl looked at the magical trail left by the dark mage with melancholy and resignation. Did he really think that she was doing it for fun, or because she liked it? The place in the native world that Minold so longed for was located in an ordinary 5-story brick building. He was moved exactly where he wanted to go. Minold caught his breath and thanked God that everything had gone well. In the apartment, everything remained the same, and he stood for a minute, enjoying the view. Where did this dark energy come from then? Minold in the past, but in reality, Mason had long missed these sensations. Finally, he returned and got out of that hole. Only one thing upset him, that the internet was unstable, and at the moment the connection was broken. At that time, soldiers were cautiously moving along the wall of his house on the street. They were sent to this area because a target had been detected here. The soldiers asked the corporal why the command had brought them here, and he replied that he didn't know anything either, and if they were curious, they should ask the officer. The very moment when the soldiers saw their target, Mason came out of the entrance. He was glad that the phone was working at all, but the lack of internet was annoying. He couldn't access any website. Turning the phone in different directions, he tried to find Wi-Fi and noticed that all the shops were closed. Although it was daytime, the soldiers saw Mason, although they were sure that civilians were not allowed into this area. They called out to the boy and ordered him to come over. Mason decided that the military was conducting some kind of exercise and obediently put his hands behind his head. At that time, one of the soldiers ordered him to run. Mason returned to base and reported that his leave had ended. Mason calmly said that this piece of meat wasn't even worth one of his punches. He looked at his palm and did not see demonic energy. It was gone. The beast pounced on him, but Mason deftly grabbed it by the head. Jean wholeheartedly thanked Mason for the gift and said that he would use it with. The soldiers were amazed at this young man's ability. Mason, wiping the blood from his face, said that this beast thought it had attacked a pitiful loser who could be pounced upon simply because he had no demonic energy left. Even if he had become a little weaker, such a monster was still no match for him. The sergeant thought that now he would have to treat this guy with respect. He looked at the monster's corpse and thought, what is he doing in this world at all? Mason apologized to the military, and they fearfully asked him not to approach them. After some time, Mason was taken to the evacuation point by car, and the driver said that he did not understand why he had gone so far. He could easily be thrown behind bars for that. He was lucky that the commander allowed them to let him go in order not to escalate the situation. The soldier asked Mason if he really didn't know what was going on at all.
No confié en absoluto en las palabras de Zen, especialmente porque dijo que había 6 mundos y que el sexto resultó estar vacío. Eso no podía ser. Por fin nuestro pequeño viaje ha terminado. Y llegamos a mi casa.
He even remembered how the soldiers killed them back then, much like now. Along with the dungeons and monsters, the so-called awakened began to appear. They are significantly superior in strength to ordinary people, and from the awakened, a squad of hunters was formed, whose task is to immediately destroy monsters that have escaped from the dungeon. Before that creature summoned him, there were no problems with monsters in Korea. Mason realized with annoyance that the strongest fighter's server on his phone still hadn't opened. He decided to take the exam as serious. The military driver, meanwhile, did not believe the passenger's words, for the whole world was in the same situation, and he said he knew nothing, which seemed suspicious, but he did not want to get involved in this matter. Mason turned to the military man and asked if people were able to evacuate painlessly, especially game developers, as he wondered if it was possible to find a job now, especially in a game company, and what had actually happened. Why was there such a mess in the country? The driver agreed to tell Mason everything he knew. He had the highest score in dungeon theory and monsterology at university. The reason why the situation has deteriorated so much exists.
Pero en ese mismo momento el mango salió disparado hacia arriba y atravesó el techo.
One day, dungeons simply started appearing more frequently and becoming larger. And worst of all, the number of giant monsters has also increased significantly. Due to this, it became more difficult for the military to control the situation, and eventually, they even had to cordon off several of the most turbulent living areas. Since then, the army has been constantly trying to push back the monsters, but there are simply not enough people.
Aún así tengo dudas sobre esta organización mágica. No en vano todas las personas poderosas del mundo son...
The soldier asked Mason how old he was, and he replied that he was about 21. The driver reminded him that it meant Mason would soon have to serve in the army for a whole 5 years. The youth was surprised, and the military man explained that due to the deteriorating situation, the authorities had changed the law And now everyone served for 5 years, not just the awakened. And if he was 21 years old, he should have already received a summons.
¿Es posible que después de tantos años sigan igual de interesados en este mundo? ¿Por qué quitarles la vida a otros solo para poder seguir viviendo tú mismo?
At that time, a message titled as an address to the nation came to the phone. This was a message about the start of his military service in Unit X.
Prefiero ser ese desertor que morir por el gremio. Empacaré todo lo que necesito y me iré hacia el atardecer.
He praised the private for his skill and, taking a chocolate bar out of his pocket, handed it to him as a reward. The soldier replied that there was a shortage of people, which is why the medical examination was now being conducted on site. And as for the date, he had apparently missed the previous reminders.
Bueno, sí, solo una persona sorda no podría oír esto. Este es el fracaso del siglo. Gracias a mi forma atlética, logré escapar de este agente. Sí, estoy bien.
When he was drafted, he was a 12th grader without a single friend. It was his lost paradise. The problem was not in his movements. Jin lacked something else. Mason entered the club and personally thanked the owner for not closing the computer club even in such difficult times.
A pesar de todos estos argumentos, continué mi camino. Mientras tanto, Zen voló como un halcón y pensó en la razón de mi escape y mi destino futuro.
Over the loudspeaker from the control room, it was announced that all the hunters taking the exam must report to the stadium. However, for some reason, his body was completely deprived of the demonic energy that was the source of magic. He was not entirely defenseless, and perhaps could still clear all the dungeons on his own. Mason decided to do just that. He firmly decided to destroy all the problems himself. Then Martin ordered to board the arriving bus quickly and in an organized manner.
No me rendí y seguí huyendo de este agente. Dejé que
Everyone looked depressed. Suddenly it was announced that the recruits had to proceed to the auditorium urgently, and Mason wondered if the army would be tougher than it had been for him in Isgard. All the new recruits were lined up in front of the podium and ordered to stand at attention. The instructors ordered not to push and to follow all their commands.
Por supuesto, este idiota narcisista me perdió entre la multitud. Pensó que me rendiría ante él tan...
He said that the attitude towards hunters is completely different from that towards members of other units, and the salary there starts from 3 million won. The soldiers were led to the center for a written test and seated at the tables. Only one newcomer raised his hand, and the instructor told him to come forward. Unexpectedly, the guy soared into the air and jumped onto a platform 5 meters above the ground.
Allí le esperaba una sorpresa, o mejor dicho, nada.
After that, he said that he was a recruit named Mason and he would like to become part of the hunting squad. In the cave of the Forgotten Canyon of the northern region of Isgard, Minold sat on the corpse of the monster he had killed. He said, addressing either himself or the dead animal, that dark mages have nothing but problems. It's the worst choice of occupation. Although they have wild skills, without demonic energy, it's all useless. Duke reminded that 3 divisions had gathered here together, and they must be honest and compete in good conscience. Earning energy while spending it is not very profitable, and for a dark mage to join a normal squad is practically impossible. The reputation gets in the way. It turns out that he has to wander through the dungeons alone, and if his demonic energy runs out inside, he's dead, so he has a question. How can a dark mage earn demonic energy more or less effectively? Minold surveyed the monsters he had killed, glanced at the campfire he had just lit. A deathly silence reigned around. He decided that he did not hear a response because everyone was dead, and then he went to the arachnid nest, where the hidden dungeon boss was located. But he too was silent. Finally, the boss emerged from the shadows and Minold was delighted by his appearance. Otherwise, he would have almost died of boredom. The boss furiously looked with his numerous eyes at the corpses of his brethren. A maw with crooked teeth opened maliciously. Minold did not like his answer to the question, and besides, the monster's mouth stank incredibly. So the mage struck the beast a powerful blow to the head. Minold was at the peak of his glory, and there were 645 days left until his return to Earth. He advised the diffused monster to pump up his physical strength. Now Mason was enjoying coffee brewed for him by the battalion commander himself. The commander was pleased with the recruit's enthusiasm and asked him to explain why he wanted to join the hunting squad so badly. Things in Korea are bad these days, and many are moving to other divisions, even the awakened ones. But Mason replied that he simply had some business in the dungeon. The test will start with the person whose name is called. Mason was becoming more and more likable to him, since all Korean dungeons were under the guard of the army.
Y aquí está la sede. donde pronto hervirán las pasiones.
Each of them possesses unique skills. Private was eliminated, and Chase announced that if a person does not score 40 points on this test, the exam is considered failed. Mason dreamed that if he got into the Hunter squad, then in theory they should let him into the dungeon, and there he would deal with most of the monsters on his own.
Dubaya solo se rió de los argumentos de la gente. No entendía cómo una persona que sentía magia en su cuerpo podía negarse a ello. Todo era una tontería, nada más.
Soul from the 104th Division passed the test with 50 points.
No sé por qué esta persona me necesitaba, pero le rogó a la gente Jean que me encontrara.
Then the creators of his favorite game will finally be able to calmly finish developing their new project, and he will become rich and successful. There was a knock on the commander's office door, and Sergeant Hazy from the hunting squad entered the room. Mason, seeing her impressive performance, remembered that she had received a special distinction along with him. Mason was next invited to take the test.
Cuando llegó mi turno de presentarme, el sheriff me miró extrañado por alguna razón, como si sospechara.
Mason thought with displeasure about the fact that this guy was saying something unimaginable. Could all hunters be like that? But in the army, there are such rules. Once told to do something, he must obey. In Isgard, there were also status windows, though he rarely opened them because there was nothing there except stat points and skill descriptions. Private Mason scored 100 points was announced. Hazy impatiently asked to tell what he had there. The window displayed an error, and he told the sergeant about it. Sergeant Hazy thought the recruit was laughing at him. All the candidates who had dropped out were taken out of the room where preparations were underway for the next test. The battalion commander looked at the warrior who had entered and noticed that they had not seen each other for a long time. And the last time they had crossed paths was in Wanshan 10 years ago, and he had never thought he would run into her here. He offered the huntress named Sal to sit down.
Como no tengo ninguna teoría, intentaremos practicar. Necesitamos recordar ese día con detalle. Entonces, a nivel subconsciente, necesitaba salvarme, y también salvar a Marie. Todo sucedió de manera inesperada y por casualidad. Ahora mi tarea es asegurarme de que los portales se abran cuando los necesito. Quien no arriesga no gana.
Of course, there won't be any special treatment for her. After all, a hunting squad is not some shoddy outfit. Simply, as a commander, he could not help but be interested, having learned that such an interesting recruit had joined them, and very soon she would have no time for conversations, which is why he wanted to tell her something in advance. He expressed confidence that it was not an easy decision. To start from the bottom, like other newcomers, people like her are needed, and he wants to thank her as a military man and a citizen of Korea. Jin asked Mason if he really thought he would fail the strength test. The commander confessed to Sal that recently he had received a very amusing report. Jean reminded that rubber bullets fly almost like real ones and advised not to try to see and avoid. At this time, the sergeant was acquainting Mason with the training center, and he was amazed at the seriousness of this structure. Obviously, taxpayers had poured a lot of money into this business. Hazy advised the rookie not to get distracted by the local scenery. It was too early for him to relax. He hadn't been accepted into the squad yet. He personally intends to test it. If it weren't for the decision of the higher-ups, he wouldn't bother with it and would send it straight to Yanshan. Mason must remember that as soon as the test reveals that he lied to them, he will be immediately sent to a court-martial. The sergeant pointed at a huge red boulder and stated that the test consisted of moving it at least a centimeter. Then he would be accepted as a hunter. He will have only 10 minutes to complete the task. If he has even a shred of hunting talent, let him prove it now. Mason was familiar with this mineral, which was called the Crimson Stone and appeared in dungeons. This material was not only extraordinarily heavy, but also extremely hard. A boulder of this size would not even flinch under the onslaught of an ordinary novice. The girl skillfully dodged bullets for a whole minute. It's impossible to look into another person's status window, and there are plenty of warriors abusing their power left and right. Hazy knew that this guy had jumped onto the 5-meter platform, but the status window didn't want to show it. It was clear to him that Mason was lying. The young man approached the stone unhurriedly, while from the observation deck on the second floor, the battalion commander and Sal began to watch Mason. The commander informed the girl that during the recruitment of new recruits, this guy demonstrated outstanding abilities. However, the young man claims that his status window is displaying an error. He admitted that he had never encountered such a case during his entire service as a commander, and therefore he had high expectations, hoping that this recruit would live up to them. Meanwhile, Mason touched the stone with his palm, the one he had seen in the dungeons of Isgard, and they were indeed absurdly heavy. He decided to show everyone what the difference in skills is. Mason focused and struck with his fist, hoping that perhaps there was at least a bit of demonic energy in this stone. The boulder shattered into small pieces from the youth's strike. Chase looked at the stopwatch and opened his mouth in surprise. The soldiers were struck by what they saw. After this trial, the fighters were lined up in front of the dungeon portal. Mason looked at his palm with regret and realized that there was nothing inside the stone. The recruits began training, and many thought it was somehow wrong. During this time, you need to reach the turning point and get a stamp on the back of your palm. After completing the training, the recruits are immediately sent into battle. So for a month, they are driven all day long to somehow prepare them for the upcoming hardships. On the very first day, the recruits were issued weights and forced to run up the infamous 6,000 steps. But that's not all. Drill Sergeant Hazy times the distance run, and it's nerve-wracking. But only in this way can physical indicators be improved in the shortest possible time, and so it should be, since they are new recruits of hunters. Although perhaps someone was mistaken, Mason broke all the rules. His body seemed light to him, like a feather, and if he had demonic energy as well, he would simply fly. These hellish hunter trainings turned out to be quite pleasant for him, and compared to the Asgardian rags, the military uniform suited him well. Saul was amazed to see him disappear into the distance. His speed was incredible. Then, after all the items on the schedule, they were supposed to rest. Mason knew there was a computer club here, and it was no worse than those in peaceful areas. He believed the bosses didn't care what he did in his free time, as long as the recruits didn't leave the center's premises. The youth thought that he could easily escape from here with the help of those crumbs of demonic energy that he could obtain if he didn't like the conditions. But in the end, these conditions helped him stay in shape. They fed him deliciously, paid him well, and gave him free time for games. Mason decided that the hunting squad was the best unit in the army, and his training mates couldn't understand where he got so much strength and energy from. The instructor Hazy was also quite surprised by this guy's abilities. The signalman on the tower raised the flag. This confirmed the capture of the hill by the White Army. The record was 3 minutes and 34 seconds. Now the White Army was entitled to a 10-minute rest in their positions.
Clara era tan pequeña que incluso recordé que los niños no entran en mi territorio en el patio, aunque Jessica me aseguró lo contrario.
Hazy was forced to keep his promise and handed Mason his dismissal papers. He was the first recruit ever to receive this slip of paper. However, good stats and physical strength are not enough for a true hunter. The most important thing is the ability to withstand monsters. Sergeant Hazy decided to observe Mason. Beginners experienced great discomfort after training and worried that it would be like this every day. Some rejoiced at the improvement of their stats. Mason watched in amazement as one of the newcomers rejoiced that his stats had increased by 1 point. For during his Asgardian training, they had improved by 10 units daily. His comrades knew that Mason had been given leave for the day and envied him. They thought that Mason achieved such results by exercising regularly. The guys just wanted to talk to him. When the girls were getting ready for bed, Sewell's neighbor in the next bed reported that Mason from the 4th squad had caught a hound the size of an elephant in the dungeon. He really enjoyed interacting with his colleagues. Someone reported that the computer club was already open. She was still a tiny tot, but always saw her dad off to work. He smiled joyfully at her and stroked her head with his strong hand. At 9 o'clock, when he decided that he should leave at least 2 hours for sleep.
Por supuesto, hay una opción. ¿Pero funcionará? ¿Qué pasaría si intentáramos crear un banco de energía mágico?
He intended to continue quenching his thirst for gambling every night. He asked the girl if she had decided where she would go immediately after leaving, since she had excellent grades and could become the best student in the volunteer division. Mason happily told his tired colleagues how yesterday he had maxed out 10 characters. It was amazing that Mason had been playing all night for the 4th week in a row and wasn't tired at all after the cross-country run.
Él, sin embargo, pasó directamente de las bromas a los negocios y por alguna razón decidió interrogarme.
Sol caught herself thinking that she was simply envious of him. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Sunny reported that he was disappointed as it was the last week of training and only half of the recruits barely passed the standards. They were the most lagging group of all.
En concreto, ¿por qué se utiliza la palabra territorio en la sociedad local?
With such a mood, they won't be able to handle the final stage of the exercises, preparation for work in the dungeon. Mason knew well that most dungeons disappear after all the monsters inhabiting them are killed. However, sometimes the dungeon remains in place even after a complete sweep. In that case, it becomes a shifting dungeon. and the structure of this dungeon changes regularly. Such dungeons are perfect for field training, as they allow you to experience various situations from a hunter's practice, and training in such ever-changing dungeons is called dungeon preparation. The recruits were not at all happy about the prospect of going into the dungeon. The lieutenant noted with satisfaction that the rookies had become nervous and decided that a little seriousness wouldn't hurt them. He always believed that recruits should be treated like racehorses, to be driven forward. Sometimes the whip is necessary, but sometimes a carrot is also needed, because panic will not help. So the officer announced that the recruit with the best result will receive 3 days and 2 nights of leave. However, the lieutenant did not see any elation on the faces of the newcomers.
Al ver mi tensión, Arthur se apresuró a informarme que querían excluirme de la lista de sospechosos.
Only one Mason expresses some enthusiasm.
¿Por qué necesitaría los registros de mi entrenamiento mágico que estudié en el patio trasero de mi propia casa si algo sucede?
They assumed they would have to spend a couple of days in the dungeon. Suddenly a truck drove up to the cave. Jin was at the practical test range of the 105th Division. Those were hounds. Many recruits saw the monsters so close for the first time and cautiously stepped back. For Mason, these beasts were no more dangerous than chihuahuas. The lieutenant expressed dissatisfaction with the recruits' fright, and yet they would still have to deal with these monsters. The commander ordered the rookies to split into groups of 4. Each group would have to defeat at least one hellhound and return from the dungeon within an hour. Sonny ordered them to cast aside their fear and fortify their fighting spirit. Sergeant Hazy ordered the recruits to approach him one by one. He handed out a special protective suit of the hunting squad to each person, which was designed to protect the body in extreme conditions. It was very heavy and simple in design. Many people's legs buckled from this thing, but Mason found that this suit had no mobility or comfort, only exceptional protection. He felt the smell of sweat and fear of the previous owner. This protective device had an unpleasant aura, and the young man didn't like it. Mason asked the lieutenant if they could take off their armor right after killing the hounds. Sonny wanted to scold the rookie for his insolence, but seeing that he was the best of the newcomers, he allowed him to act at his own discretion. However, he must remember that this is a team exercise and he cannot do everything for his comrades. He expressed a desire to see how Recruit Mason is able to work in a team. Comrades of the former mage could not understand how they would kill the hound with the help of this useless protective suit, and Mason decided to devise a plan. It was very simple, and he decided to tell his comrades how to properly kill hounds. However, in real combat, everything is much harder. Hounds will lunge at them in attempts to bite their necks, and when they leap, they should simply grab their paws and break the monster's spine. Usually this is enough to kill the hound, but if it's still alive, they just have to pull its 2 halves in opposite directions and tear it in half.
Alpha Chester sabía mucho más, pero aún no había confirmación de ello.
Meanwhile, the lieutenant announced the start of the training, and the instructor opened the cage with the animals. Jin lowered his sword and followed the instructor's order, leaving the training. Mason explained to his astonished comrades that these monsters had spent the whole day in some cage, and were now heading home. Perhaps he was still not entirely confident in his abilities. They asked Mason where he knew monster psychology so well from, and the young man thought about how he himself had been one. The lieutenant ordered his subordinates to stop laughing and chatting during the training. He decided to send Mason's team into the dungeon first. Chase, seeing that he had chosen the baton, assumed that it would not be easy for Mason. Lieutenant Sonny radioed the instructors inside the dungeon, ordering them to stay vigilant and monitor the situation in case the recruits found themselves in danger and needed assistance. The pair of instructors in the dungeon received the commander's order.
Si no logras ganar dinero, al menos deberías proteger tu hogar con la ayuda de la mano.
The Corporal Dave's partner reported that the recruits of the first group had already entered inside, while the rest were outside. In just 4 seconds, nothing remained of the monsters. Dave knew that this guy was under special surveillance and he was the strongest rookie of them all. His achievements during 4 weeks of training are mind-blowing, and he will probably also show top-class performance in the dungeon.
Por supuesto, miré el arma, pero no había garantía de que me salvara de los agentes mágicos.
Of course, he could quickly finish it off by killing all the hounds himself, but then his teammates would not gain any combat experience. A pack of hounds, meanwhile, rushed at the recruits. Noticing the fear on the faces of his comrades, Mason asked them not to be afraid, for the suits they were wearing were really sturdy. He decided to take command and wondered which of the monsters would attack him first. The beasts were already quite close. The leader of the monsters, who was slightly ahead of his kin, Mason knocked out with a single blow. Mason replied with a smile on his face that he would watch their further. One of the newcomers who was attacked by the beast asked for help. Mason killed the second animal with a powerful kick.
Al regresar a casa de la tienda con tales noticias, no sabía qué hacer.
Mason exclaimed that if this were a real dungeon raid, 2 people would already be dead. There were many of them, and this advantage should be used to corner the hounds. Inspired by Mason's confident words, the recruits began to press on the monsters, and they became frightened.
Si ocurre un asesinato, significa que el asesino en serie mágico todavía está suelto.
Usually during the first dungeon practice, the rookies lose their heads from fear and can't do anything. But thanks to Mason's guidance, this group managed to overcome their fright. The corporal's partner asked Dave if some sergeant could be reborn in a recruit's body, and he replied that it seemed he had read too many novels. Mason not only dealt with all the hounds on his own, but also helped his comrades cooperate and organize teamwork. This guy gets the highest score for preparation for work in the dungeon. The other recruits will get an average score. The recruits saw the instructors emerging from ambush and realized that they had been there all along.
Finalmente entrené mi magia espacial, y ya podía ver todo lo que estaba sucediendo en la ciudad.
The former dark wizard added that he knows the instructors as the most genuine good guys. Warriors were returning home. The corporal ordered everyone to move towards the exit quickly. The cave walls shook so violently that it seemed an earthquake had begun, but it was no earthquake, for they were in a shifting dungeon, and it was rearranging itself right then.
Nadie podría haberlo previsto, pero me quedé dormido. ¿Cómo es esto posible? Pero al mismo tiempo, una Jessica preocupada llamó a mi puerta.
The corporal's partner reminded Dave that there was still a whole month until the next transformation, but he stated that they needed to urgently evacuate the newcomers to a safe place first. Dave turned to the recruits and said that an unforeseen situation had occurred. However, there is no reason to worry. They will wait an hour at this spot, as prescribed in the instructions, and perhaps the entrance will open again. The newcomers regained their spirit. They thought they were stuck here forever. The instructor added that they were also working on solving the problem on the other side, and the lieutenant would take all necessary steps to save them. Reinforcements would definitely arrive. The truth was known only to Mason among all the newcomers. The reason why this particular dungeon was chosen for cadet training was that everyone was 100% certain of its predictability. The fact that the entrance suddenly closed came as a surprise to everyone. The red-headed Joe noticed that Mason already had 3 stripes on his jacket and stated that he would soon grow up to be a sergeant. If the dungeon has transformed into a closed one, it won't be so easy to get out of it. There was something similar in Isgard as well, but nothing truly catastrophic happened because Mason was here. He reported that he was heading to the administration to report on the general meal of the entire detachment. This is in honor of one of them getting the highest score on the promotion test. He seemed very frightened. Dave explained to him that the entrance to the dungeon could disappear in 2 cases. The first being when the dungeon disappears, the entrance vanishes after a complete clearing.
Langley pidió ayuda y prometí ayudarlo en todo lo que pudiera, pero necesitaba más detalles.
It turns out that the dungeon has transformed into a closed one, and the exit has disappeared, and monsters have appeared here again. The only way to get out of this closed dungeon is to kill all the monsters in it to the last one. A large and bright moon rose over the outpost. In the dungeon now, there are 4 cadets without combat experience and 2 instructors.
Esta dama claramente tiene habilidades mágicas.
The corporal thought about how they still didn't know what kind of monsters had appeared here. And if they were unlucky with enemies, everything could end badly. But there was nothing to be done, and they had to keep moving while they still had the strength to fight. It would be much easier if the instructors had proper equipment. When Mason first summoned him, he was very different from his expectations, which surprised him greatly, but soon a good idea came to him.
Uno de los hombres lobo atacó a Jessica porque me trajo a la casa.
The protective suits of the recruits had to be used. The cadets need to be placed in front so that they take the hit with these heavy suits, while they, the instructors, will kill the monsters distracted by the newcomers.
Estas palabras o mis acciones provocaron la ira del sheriff, pero volvió a preguntar a todos si habían escuchado mis palabras.
Suddenly something caught Mason's attention. Dave suddenly fell to the ground, clutching his throat with his hands, and his partner rushed to help the corporal despite Mason's protests. It was a sergeant, and Mason quickly said that he just hadn't had a beer for a long time and that's why he went out to get some fresh air. Mason ordered his team members to stay in their places, warning that anyone who approached the instructors would meet the same fate. He reported that nothing serious had happened to them. It was just a feint.
El sheriff explicó que la manada de hombres lobo actualmente no puede contraatacar debido a su gran número, y que simplemente están siendo asesinados.
The sergeant immediately asked him not to relax and to continue in the same spirit. The recruits warned Mason that going alone was dangerous, since even the instructors couldn't handle it. However, Mason had already delved into the dungeon and was glad that it existed on Earth as well. Demonic energy.
La encontré y resultó que ella misma se fue con los vampiros.
It was not surprising that they fell ill, even though they were awakened. Before going into the dungeon with traces of demonic energy, the Asgradians were given special protection. For ordinary people, the influence of demonic energy can be fatal. For dark mages, demonic energy is like a phone charger. The commander stated that this guy exceeded all his expectations. He also heard that Mason dealt with all the middle bats at the oil depot.
Y con la ayuda de armas de fuego existe la posibilidad de matar a estas criaturas.
Mason could not even dream of meeting the Dark Hound. The spread of rumors throughout the company is only a matter of time, in which case they will also turn their attention to Mason. For the first time, he encountered this creature about a year after being summoned to Isgard. He nearly died then because he had never read about this species in any book before, and of course, tried to attack it.
Pero necesitamos preparar algunas cosas para el trabajo.
Mason met the monster's attack with a direct punch and thanked her for the treat of dark magic. Perhaps they are witnessing the birth of a new legend. He was still nauseated by the smell of blood. After the death of the Dark Hound, a lot of demonic energy spills out of it, which is why they are difficult to defeat. The blood of this monster is poisonous, and upon contact with it, ordinary people's skin begins to rot. In the morning, the soldiers suffered from hangovers. Mason found it very pleasant to absorb demonic energy for the first time in such a long time. But what is the Dark Hound doing in this world? He thought such monsters only dwelled in Isgar, however. It's good that there are also monsters containing demonic energy on Earth. But judging by the instructor's reaction, you don't often meet such people here, and there was no mention of demonic energy at all during the lectures and training. The probability that the Dark Hound made an interdimensional journey is zero. Only a very powerful dark mage, like him or a priest using divine powers, is capable of such a feat. Creating a portal is not accessible to everyone. He asked Mason if he had been to the gym, and he replied that he hadn't had a chance yet. The sergeant asked him not to be shy and to come, since he was now also At this time, the instructors were gradually coming to their senses. The corporal promised to do it, for this man was from the VR team of hunters. Finally, they were convinced that everything was in order and there were no casualties. The truth is, they learned with trepidation that Mason had gone off alone to explore the dungeon. The corporal was beside himself with rage. How did he even think of separating from the group in such a dangerous situation? By this alone, he deserved to be kicked out of the training center. But for now, he has no right to talk about it. He was supposed to protect the recruits, but he fainted. And now they had to urgently follow Mason's trail. And at that moment, they saw him. Mason returned not alone, but with prey on his shoulders. There was also an opportunity to choose a weapon. The instructors curiously examined the monster's dead body and concluded that it was because of it that they had lost consciousness. Everyone was amazed that Mason alone had brought down such a huge monster, which was incomparable to ordinary hounds. Suddenly, the entrance was illuminated by a bright blue flame. A portal had opened. Corporal Dave respectfully asked Mason if he had really handled that hound by himself. Dave ordered his partner to take all the rookies outside, and he would catch up with them soon.
Pero Arthur no me escuchó y continuó haciendo preguntas, diciendo que yo no olía a magia en absoluto.
He should not omit any details, including the incompetence of the instructors.
Fue una batalla que valió la pena, ya que pude recolectar muchas cosas interesantes de los vampiros con las que necesitaba lidiar. Estaba a punto de irme cuando Jessica salió corriendo tras de mí.
Mason thanked the corporal shyly for the kind words. Dave replied, pulling his cap over his eyes, that a real man should be able to admit his mistakes, but it was time for them to head back. The corporal could not imagine how he would report everything to his superiors. Mason thought that the last week of training had been eventful. The golems looked powerful and very lifelike. The screen displayed a message that the error had been fixed, but the young man did not understand what error it was. Mason now anticipated a real monster. He read in the status that he is the founder of the Sistrenka Lumi cult, the best character with the idiotic skill of spoilage. He looked around joyfully and realized that everyone had finally arrived. Having achieved the best results in dark magic during his stay in Isgard, he created this cult for a joke, to fend off fans who followed him everywhere. After that, the number of fans only increased. But Mason felt that he had significantly weakened, and his stats became much worse than he had expected. Having discovered that upon returning to Earth his demonic energy had disappeared, he decided that he should expect other unpleasant surprises as well. But that was already too much. Out of the countless number of skills he had managed to master, he had only one left, and even that was spoilage, a very weak skill. The effect of the curse is just a stomachache. The simulation was completed.
Esperaba que cualquier rastro que pudiera haber dejado ardiera en el fuego y nadie pudiera descubrir nada.
Now he had a clear goal. He urgently needed to regain his strength. Mason didn't even expect that, so to gain skills, you don't even have to go to the dungeon. No matter what, it's better than those days in Isgard when he had nothing else to do but endure. The developers had to wait for him. In the training center, utter chaos reigned. The fact that the dungeon closed during the exercise and the lieutenant was unable to give clear orders was an emergency situation. In addition, the rookie eliminated several monsters with his own hands without outside help, while the instructors were immediately eliminated. Due to a series of unforeseen events, the recruits who were supposed to be assigned their first rank and released peacefully before departure now had to wait for the command's decision. Jin could not believe that Mason had done it alone. Mason suggested to Private Jean to go and talk about it in the training room. It was assumed that this guy could easily become a sergeant within 2 years.
Fue el turno de Felicia Black de ser examinada.
Sonny greeted the newcomer. Then he dismissed from the office the errant soldier responsible for checking the dungeons. The lieutenant punished him for negligence. Then the officer informed Mason that he had summoned him for a special conversation. Sonny informed the young man that he had scored the highest score and had an offer. The soldier awaited the sergeant's order. The sergeant ordered the private to tell Mason that the commander was looking for him. Lieutenant Sonny thought of Mason as an unusual guy and thanked his fate for being lucky enough to live to meet him. Who knew that the Heron would turn out to be such that even excellent recruits would seem like a brood of chicks against her background?
Y en segundo lugar, era un residente local que no se llevaba bien con los chupasangres.
The commander told the guy that he knew that Mason wanted to climb the career ladder as soon as possible. But according to the rules, privates could not apply for a promotion during their first year of service.
Pero Rey no confiaba en él y confiaba en sus propias habilidades. Yo, a mi vez, decidí averiguar qué logré sacar de la guarida de los vampiros.
On his mighty shoulders lay an enormous barbell. Lieutenant thought that perhaps he had gone a bit too far with Chervone. It was unlikely that Mason was that desperate, but a promise of promotion wouldn't be enough here.
En el fondo de la bolsa encontré placas de cerámica pintadas que podrían haber pertenecido al mago, pero aún no hay tiempo para clasificarlas.
Even in Isgard, there was something good where the strength indicators were increased by 150%. It was a good skill that became more effective as the indicators grew. In fact, Mason didn't care where to serve as long as there was career advancement, and if they made an exception for him, that would be perfect. In addition to everything else, there are a bunch of dungeons in Chervona, and that's exactly what he needs. For his plan, rapid advancement is simply necessary. The higher the rank, the more mobility options he has. Even a hedgehog understands that the fastest way to get a promotion is by defending dungeons. And that's why Mason agreed to the lieutenant's proposal. Mason thanked the private, still not hiding his delight at the acquired force skill.
Y otra vez, en el momento más inoportuno, llegó alguien, aunque yo no esperaba.
Comrades asked Mason to contact them as soon as he arrived in Chervon. The youth swore that he would not forget his comrades even in that remote place. Friends did not understand why he still volunteered to serve there, where everyone is afraid to end up. Mason replied that he had incredible life ambitions. Everyone decided that Mason was just crazy. Mason looked sadly at the departing transport that was taking away his noisy comrades, and he was left alone. After some time, a truck came for him. A soldier in dark glasses and with the emblem of the Invincibles on his gymnastiorka specified the name of the recruit. He apologized for the delay due to snow. It was announced that the platoon was tasked with clearing the dungeon. The young man sat down on a bench in the back of the truck, placing his backpack with belongings at his feet. This dungeon is the lair of monsters called the Trench. Mason was not bothered by the harsh training and constant monster attacks. Only one thing concerned him. It was an initiation ritual. In addition, Private Jim and Staff Sergeant Quinn entered the lair of the rat monsters. Although this dungeon is not considered dangerous, on average, about 200 rat monsters are encountered in it. The truck arrived at the unit's territory. Mason did indeed notice snow everywhere.
Una de ellas era una firma mágica que no tenía ningún significado.
The soldier who brought him led him to the barracks and ordered the soldiers to show the newcomer where everything was. Due to the terrible stench in the dungeon, the hunters were forced to wear special gas masks. They inquired about his name and stated that they had heard of him as a super soldier who tore a hound apart with his bare hands. Rotten bananas were the bait for the rat monsters. The fighters quickly laid out the bait in all corners of the dungeon. They looked at him with such happiness in their eyes, as if they had been given a new toy. One of them asked why Mason had come here instead of going to the rear, since with his grades he could have done so. The youth replied that it was easiest to gain combat experience and advance in service at the front. His interlocutors stared at Mason in silence and suspiciously, deciding that he was not quite right in the head.
Como dicen, la mejor defensa es un buen ataque. Inmediatamente advertí que no diría nada sin un abogado.
Mason decided that if he showed something, these annoying fighters would leave him alone.
Yo seguía agresivo y no quería comunicarme con ellos. Pero eso no detuvo a Ray y me preguntó sobre los vampiros que vivían en Vinuta.
However, when they saw Mason doing vertical push-ups on one finger, they were very surprised. They could not believe that the newcomer could do vertical push-ups on one finger. Sergeant Hazy struck powerful blows with his fist, destroying monsters in whole packs. At that very moment, a sergeant entered the room and ordered Mason to stop doing push-ups. The young man found his voice very familiar. Mason looked up and recognized Sergeant Hazy.
Supuse que la sospecha recaía sobre mí porque percibieron mi resistencia. Ahora seguro que estarán muy interesados en mí.
Hazy reported that he had been sent to them for 4 days and advised them to leave him alone. It was immediately apparent that they had undergone special training. Hazy took out his phone and started watching a lesson on volcanic dungeons. Even in such a small place, there were representatives of the most diverse ranks, and here, it seemed, no one was older than 30. Suddenly, the rats broke through to the rear line. Hazy asked him to instruct the junior in rank. Jin approached Mason and stated his name. He offered him to have a snack first, as he had just received permission to visit the soldier's store. Mason was surprised that even this required permission, and Jin offered to let him take anything he wanted from the store on his account. Mason did not immediately notice how the ground beneath his feet heaved. They and Jin bought groceries for 300,000 won. When the guys walked over to the table and sat down, Mason asked Jin why he couldn't go to the store whenever he wanted. The person replied that privates first class and below can go to the store a maximum of 3 times a week, and also only privates first class and above can visit the gym and computer club. This information displeased Mason greatly, as it turned out that he was not allowed to visit the computer club. Jin agreed that it was a very stupid rule, but they couldn't do anything about it and had to put up with it. The monster had already raised its huge clawed paw over him. Jin replied that to resolve such an issue, one would need to rise at least to the rank of corporal, more likely to sergeant, and that it is very difficult. Mason realized that there was no other way but career advancement, but he still thought that the ban on visiting the computer club was too much. Jin continued to speak and stated that in their unit it was not easy even to become a sergeant. He had failed the exam for the umpteenth time. It was already the 3rd year, and he was still a private first class. When everyone already thought it was the end for them, Mason rushed to their aid with a shield. Sergeant Shaw entered the store, and Jin invited him to join the meal. The corporal noticed his frenzied eyes and extraordinary energy. It was magic again. A blinding flash and explosion knocked the fighters off their feet. Having eaten his fill, the sergeant said that he would not comment on their chatter, but if tomorrow at the firing range they proved useless, they could consider themselves walking corpses, and they shouldn't even hope that he would go easy on the rookie. Lieutenant ordered Mason to leave the danger zone and called on the fighters to attack the monster. Sho stared at the private with a stern look and asked him if he didn't think he was asking too much of them, and Jin hurried to assure the sergeant otherwise. This sergeant was really getting on Mason's nerves, and he was running out of patience. He hid his hands under the table and used his spoiling skill, mentally ordering Shaw to spit out all the food. He was only worried that no one would see his magical energy. He began convulsively looking at the expiration date labels on food products. A rat, struck by the immense power of dark energy, fell to the ground.
Ahora definitivamente estoy en la lista de buscados. Y el rodamiento claramente interesó a Ray.
Mason shifted his gaze to his new companion and asked what he was saying about training at the shooting range. Jin explained that they would be shooting from a KH-2 with enhanced cartridges and clarified that this weapon was very powerful. And bullets during training exercises are like a pony for riding. They're bullets, like an unbroken Colt, and the recoil is much stronger, and besides, there's such a noise, as if you were firing from a cannon. Jin explained that monsters appear much more frequently here than in other regions, so stronger weapons are needed. At first, it may be a bit difficult to get used to, so he shouldn't worry if the sergeant bites him a little, it's normal.
Encontré esta pequeña tienda. Parecía algo anticuada, rara.
He reported that this monster was defeated by a single soldier. He was eagerly awaiting the next day. In the morning, the entire unit went to the firing range. Mason apologized for attacking without warning back then.
Los libros eran regulares, pero los precios eran simplemente escandalosos. La pregunta es, ¿por qué? Y aquí encontré un libro que realmente vale la pena. Defensa mágica. Un tratado sobre...
Ace inquired about Mason's condition, and he replied that he was fine. The best score of the squad was 14 hits. The commander of the 2nd Platoon of the 2nd Company of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Lieutenant Charlie, who was observing the shooting from the command tower, could not believe the result of the rookie, and the 1st Sergeant Tommy standing next to him told him that there were rumors that this soldier was a genius. When asked by his colleagues how he did it, Mason replied that he simply followed the instructions.
Los libros estaban levitando en el aire, y el anciano ni siquiera se esforzó usando magia. Yo estaba encantado.
He could hardly wait to see his shooting during the evening extra practice. One of the guys who was in charge in the barracks asked the sergeant if it wasn't too early for the rookie to go for extra training, but he ordered him to put a helmet on his dumb head and go to work. Colleagues congratulated Mason on his skillful shooting and informed him that if he had hit all 20, he would have been given a day off.
Y aquí vienen nuestros viejos amigos tratando de localizarme.
Jin replied that usually newcomers are not allowed to attend additional training sessions until they get used to using their unusual weapons. They will explain everything to him in any case, but he can tell him briefly. During an additional training session, 2 squads simultaneously go through a kind of obstacle course. On their way to the finish line, they must deal with monsters. However, he assumed that Mason had killed the rat with his fist, and the young man replied that he had no other choice. Besides, you cannot hit the human dummies that sometimes appear on the path. Hitting a civilian once results in an automatic failure.
Mientras tanto, leí aquellos libros en los que pensé que habría mucha información útil, pero al final no encontré nada valioso, excepto para qué sirven las baldosas cerámicas.
Having listened to the private first class, Mason thought that the obstacle course and live monsters were a lot of fun. Mason's scores are almost twice as high as most sergeants. Jin, sitting at the table opposite Mason, couldn't stop marveling at his successful shooting, to which the young man replied that his 13 hits were also an excellent result.
En un día pude visitar un buen número de tiendas. Conocí vampiros, hombres lobo y magos.
In this matter, Sergeant Hazy is a real ace who averages 17 hits and is considered the best shooter in the squad. He could even be taken as a sergeant already. There are cyber lectures and all sorts of other gadgets. Jin told Mason that he had no doubt about his excellent results in the extra training. The lieutenant did not insist, but said that if the corporal changed his mind, he could tell him, but the comrade replied that people are assigned to groups by those senior in rank, so he could not promise him anything, and Mason inquired about the selection criteria. Jin услышал, что это банальная лотерея. Staff Sergeant Quinn announced that the training would begin in 5 minutes and ordered all soldiers to put on bulletproof vests, lining up in a row. Mason, along with other colleagues, received his vest. Sergeant Shaw approached the young man and said that he was assigned to the same squad and the difference in skills would be radical. Still, for a private to become a sergeant is as difficult as crawling to China. Mason thought that this bastard didn't understand anything and kept messing with him. The show reminded that the average time for passing the obstacle course is 3 minutes, and asked Mason if the newcomer could stand out here as well.
Esta chica también parece estar buscando algo y claramente no está contenta con algo.
The show didn't like that the newcomer was silent, and he continued to verbally mock him. The sergeant said that if Mason dragged his feet, he would give him a beating. And in general, there is a certain level in everything. Unexpectedly, Sho bowed to Jin and thanked him for the rescue in the dungeon. At first, during the training, 2 people descend together into an underground training complex. Here, the soldiers will have to destroy monsters. At the same time, they must protect civilians, or rather dummies representing them.
Me presenté como una persona interesante. Denver Brown, profesor.
The one who clears the strip as quickly and neatly as possible will be considered the best. The winner will be the one who ultimately presses the red button located at the finish line first. On the screen, the judges can observe icons of monsters of different sizes that the competitors encounter along the way. The more dangerous the monster, the bigger the icon on the screen. On each lane, there are two monsters, and random enemies appear there. No one ever knows what to expect. John met a rowing toad on his way. She praised the knight for a good job. On the screen, it was noticeable that Kim was moving faster in his lane, although he was less lucky with the monsters, and the opponent still had a chance to catch up on time. Kim destroyed the first monster and continued moving. He decided that it would be easy. He would just kill the next monster and rush to the finish. However, this monster turned out to be very strong. She parted the fabric covering the cage. Deep inside the cell, the monster's emerald eyes glowed.
De repente su mirada brilló y me preguntó si había encontrado.
But she had already started the ritual. The screen displayed John's lap time. Red-haired Joe, leaning on a shovel, discontentedly asked why they had to do the construction work and how much longer they would have to suffer. When the breathless Kim appeared at the finish line, John asked him why it took him so long to get here, how he was going to defend the motherland if he was such a slowpoke, and besides, he had now lost him a pack of goodies from the store. It turned out that not only did his partner arrive late at the finish line, but he also shot a civilian, so he could have taken his time, as Kim would have been disqualified anyway. Watching the soldiers of the first detachment, Sho realized that they had even made a bet for food. Mason approached the sergeant and suggested making another bet. He suggested betting on a wish and let the strongest win. Shu laughed but accepted the offer. The sergeant, in fact, reported that he had no desires that an ordinary private could fulfill, and that he would have to give him his entire salary for at least the next 3 months. Mason was not surprised that this sergeant was gambling. He agreed to give up his salary for 3 months if he loses. Then the sergeant turned to the commander and said that he had gone to the divisional headquarters for supplies and overheard something. First Sergeant Quinn called the next group to the start line. Joe, upon hearing this, wanted it to be a joke.
Para confirmar sus palabras, dijo que podía concertar una reunión con un mago que conocía.
At first, he did not intend to stick his neck out, understanding that it was not worth doing. But he simply lacks the maturity not to react to provocations. Many already knew that the sergeant and the private had made a bet and could not understand the point of it, since the private had no chance of winning. Suddenly, the venue of the competition shook as if from an earthquake. Mason asked him who he was talking to. On the observation screen, everyone noticed a huge icon that appeared on one of the obstacle strips. Mason, being on it, noticed that the ground under his feet was shaking and decided that it was happening because of the monster. What he saw exceeded all his expectations. Mason looked at the huge monster and asked it what it eats. Without wasting time, he attacked Mason. The recruit barely managed to leave the area of his attack. Mason understood that indiscriminate shooting in all directions would cause him problems, and if he hit a mock-up representing a civilian, he would be disqualified. The horned monster was already looming over Mason with its huge body.
Una vez que todo estuvo decidido con los hombres lobo, estos agentes lo investigaron todo.
Its clawed paws reached out towards Mason's body, but his dark magic had already left its marks on the monster's paws. Soon the skin of this monster will start rotting everywhere.
Eso significaba que no me había distanciado de ellos tanto como me hubiera gustado. Y ahora estoy corriendo en una motocicleta por la autopista, desarrollando una velocidad loca.
Its other name was the Devouring Demon, which absorbed energy, and then its regeneration increased and its attack power rose sharply.
Decidí que antes de hacer cualquier cosa, necesitaba visitar la guarida del vampiro y averiguar contra quién tendría que pelear. Chester me dio los contactos de los supervisores locales, pero es mejor evitarlos a todos.
The sergeant did not understand what could have enraged him so much that he attacked the recruit.
Los chupasangres locales decidieron esconderse en el...
It was, of course, easy to catch him, but it was still a shooting practice, and Mason opened fire from the machine gun. However, the bullets that hit the monster's head did little harm to it. The lieutenant reminded him that his current address was in a restricted area and asked where he had spent his last vacation. The youth was surprised by the fact that, despite the wounds, the monster actively attacked and could still see and hear well. The next attack of this beast passed just a few centimeters from Mason's head. His parents used to live there, but due to work, they moved. And now the apartment is vacant. He lives there during vacations, and that's why it's clean.
Perras sin alma.
Sergeant Quinn, armed with heavy weaponry, hurried to assist the recruit. He considered what happened to be his mistake. The one-eyed demon consuming energy. This is a monster that an ordinary private soldier will never be able to defeat with personal firearms. Sergeant, with all his might, was heading towards Mason and prayed to God that he would hold on a little longer. Meanwhile, having dealt with his monsters, Sergeant Shaw glanced at his watch and saw that he had done it in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And with that time, Mason was no match for him. He rushed towards the finish line, thinking that it was too easy a victory for him, and was already deciding what he would do with the money he had won from Mason. However, he was in for a disappointment. His opponent was already at the red button.
Gale hizo un buen trabajo con la tarea.
Sergeant Shaw cried out in indignation and resentment. Mason bypassed the security by sneaking across the rooftops of adjacent buildings. No one had ever finished the first extra training session in under 2 minutes, and everyone considered the rookie Mason a real machine. He was curious to find out what creature would meet him there this time. He called his little friend and asked him to find out what kind of monster was sitting there. The genie inquired how he managed to defeat the one-eyed demon, and the young man replied that he simply followed the instructions.
Pienso que las termitas se las arreglarán perfectamente con las caras de estos chupasangres.
The sergeant indignantly replied that the victory was unfair and therefore the dispute should be annulled. He explained that initially there was only one condition. He should not come later than the recruit. But during training, everyone must kill 2 monsters, and only after that go to the finish line. As the rules require, he killed 2 monsters, but the rookie only 1. That's why he didn't lose the bet.
Los vampiros ni siquiera entendían lo que les esperaba. Estaban disfrutando su momento. De repente apareció un pequeño regalo.
Mason saw how vile this man was, but despite it being an unusual case, he felt disgusted that he had landed the winning punch during extra shooting practice, so he just wanted to bury this dispute. Mason asked Shaw why he was sorting things out with Private First Class Gene instead of him personally. Sergeant Hazy then joined the conversation, stating that Shaw should be ashamed because the recruit had been in serious danger. Usually a one-eyed demon is quite harmless, but when it mutates, its danger increases several times. It's much easier to kill 2 monsters than to deal with it, isn't it obvious? Mason used the disassembly skill. He asked him if he boasted about his title through his successors, and Hazy replied that it was Shaw who boasted about the title. Shaw backed down and asked Hazy to sort it out, not in front of subordinates. It was just a joke on his part. Mason saw that the goblin had ruined his clothes. Having a high rank is quite convenient, especially when you see the person who used to run everything here so obediently submitting to you.
Y convertirse en una chuleta, a pesar de todos sus escudos. Ahora todo ha terminado.
He raised his hands and replied with a chuckle that he had nothing to say. Hazy walked away and said that's how it should be.
Chester no tenía idea de que ya había completado una tarea y estaba esperando noticias de los vampiros.
It became known that this happened because one junior sergeant who had served until promotion got into trouble in the dungeon, and Sergeant Hazy also nearly died. Mason asked Gene with annoyance. So there is no longer an opportunity to get a special promotion, and his friend replied that to do this, it is necessary to save civilians in an emergency situation.
Y ya estaba de reconocimiento en el tercer nido. Era necesario averiguar cuántas de estas criaturas había. Había 13 vampiros y nuevamente un mago protegido, pero se sintió la presencia de alguien más.
No matter how much Mason wanted a promotion, he could not wish for emergencies for civilians. It was believed that the North Korean army was virtually defeated, and the monsters came to the front line every day, however. It was very quiet here for now. He had enough of 2 days of an ordinary soldier's life. Now he wanted to start developing. Shard of a knife or arrow. Mason decided that this goblin was wounded by a hunter from the search party. But it seemed to him that he had seen something similar. All hunters were ordered to immediately gather at the oil depot and set up protective shields. Mid-bats are child-sized bats living in swarms. They are not particularly dangerous, but extremely agile. Mason decided to test a new skill level E. The appearance of these specimens at the oil depot constitutes an emergency situation in which the entire squad may be destroyed.
Por regla general, mis explosiones también activaban las alarmas de incendio en este.
Shooting at them with firearms was prohibited due to the nearby oil depot. Besides, the shots could attract other aggros here. They had only to observe the situation until people came who would set up shields.
Mi aparición en la celda cerrada y también desde la pared los sorprendió y los asustó. Les dicté mis condiciones de liberación, que confiaran en mí y que sus ojos estuvieran cerrados.
Stepping through the portal, Mason found himself in the city. At that moment, Mason appeared next to them and said that he would distract the monsters. The soldiers recognized the recruit from the second platoon. They asked him to leave immediately, since he would not be able to do anything without special equipment. The young man thought that he did not need it, for guests had arrived who would provide him with a promotion. In this situation, he can get the rank of private, having single-handedly dealt with an emergency situation in which the entire squad could have suffered, as well as experience as a bonus, so he does not intend to restrain himself. He concentrated his dark magic in his hands. On the way, they must deal with monsters and be in full combat ready. The commander ordered the fighters to prepare for the appearance of monsters. They saw flying toothy spheres. At this time, soldiers arrived with equipment for installing shields. One of the soldiers turned to Sergeant Hazy and drew his attention to what was happening ahead. Mason was dealing with the aggros, tearing them to pieces with his bare hands.
La conversación fue interrumpida por una llamada telefónica.
Sergeant ordered Mason to duck down and get back right now. What the hell was he doing there without a bulletproof vest? Mason ignored the commander's words and considered all these monsters his prey. But soon he ordered to cease fire and prepare for close combat. The sergeant suddenly felt a cramp in his stomach.
No sabían con seguridad si era obra mía, pero Ray insistió en mi participación.
Mason asked the sergeant not to worry about him, because he would quickly deal with these mice using an electric fly swatter.
El rostro de Ray se iluminó después de escuchar que se había encontrado algo.
He acted quickly and efficiently. Mason thought that, of course, it would be easier to use dark arrows. One of them, quite large, rushed to attack the fighters. This monster differed from its kin with huge fangs and terrifying eyes. The squad was shooting down the flying spheres like at a shooting range. Soon they were done away with. Mason approached the middle bat and asked if he had not been taught that playing with fire is no joke. The air was sliced by several lightning bolts, and the soldiers thought, when did this guy manage to go so far? Finally, the shields were installed and activated, and the military began collecting the dead middle bats. Ace replied that he couldn't say for sure, but there were rumors that it wasn't a dungeon of empty cans. They say there was one boss monster in this dungeon. Hazy replied that 30 individuals had been killed, and wondered what the duty officer had been so busy with that he hadn't even deigned to show up on time. Even if it is not specialized in military operations, how can it appear only after the situation has been resolved, without providing any assistance? Rumors circulated, each more terrifying than the last, but it seems that this boss was captured alive and locked in the gathering point, for fear that the dungeon would collapse.
Sí, Chester no me delató, pero si pasa algo no podrá ayudarme de ninguna manera. Esto ya lo podíamos haber adivinado.
Hazy replied affirmatively, and added that he not only handled one middle bat with electrical equipment, he single-handedly finished them all off. The duty officer asked incredulously, could one person really have defeated all those middleweight fighters? At that time, Mason approached them and said that he had come to return the electric rod that Sergeant Hazy had lent him.